in eighth grade social studies class, we had to write an essay on a great American. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so there was some Roberto Clementes in there and Mean Joe Greens and a lot of George Washingtons and Abraham Lincolns and the Wright brothers. I wrote about Duane Allman.
Nice. Alan Paul is a journalist, rock and roll expert, and a key scholar on the Allman Brothers Band. His book, One Way Out, The Inside History of the Allman Brothers Band, is a really fun and interesting read, man. And it's like a collection of interviews. You get a bunch of different perspectives as you move through the book.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an oral history, and all of the interviews are conducted by me. So occasionally somebody will ask me why I didn't include any quotes from Duane Allman and Barry Oakley, and a few other people, but mostly those two. And it's just because I made the decision when I wrote that book, everything in it was from interviews I did. And of course, I never had the opportunity to interview those gentlemen. Yeah, so that's why.
Were you starstruck, like talking to Greg Allman?
I mean, I remember very well the first time I interviewed Greg and the first time I met him, and I probably definitely was a bit starstruck, but that was pretty early in my career, luckily enough, when they had reformed in 1989, and then their first comeback album came out in 1990, Seven Turns. I did a big feature on them for Pulse magazine, which was the in-house magazine for Tower Records.
Yes.
Which was a really, really good magazine, actually, and a very important place for me early in my career. And that was certainly an important article. I interviewed Greg and Dickie and Warren Haynes and Alan Woody and Phil Walden, the original manager, who they had really were on the outs with it.
Right.
Oblivious to that at that time. A lot of history that I know now I didn't know then. I interviewed Tom Dowd, who produced it and produced their classic album. So it was a huge story for me that changed my whole arc of my life and career, actually. But when One Way Out came out, it was the combination of 20 plus, probably 25 years of reporting. And although I didn't fully realize it always during those years, I was sort of playing the long game. I think you'd have to be pretty crazy to spend 25 years actively writing a book. But that's ultimately what I was doing, because guys like Dickie Betts and Greg Allman, they've been burned by the press. They've felt burned so many times in their lives that they're pretty slow to come around and really open up and trust someone. So it really, took a lot of years to get to that level of familiarity and trust. In 1991, I started working at Guitar World as the managing editor, which was right around the same time that the Allman Brothers were coming to New York every March, or most Marches, for extended runs. So they started being around a lot. I was doing those interviews after that very first one from a musician's perspective. If you went in under the guise of Guitar World, not the guys, that's what we were doing, but you could really get guys to open up. You start off talking guitars and you can get to a level of comfort much faster. But it was a great entry point and a great way to have the barriers down a little bit at the start of a conversation.
And that's your guitar on the wall behind you?
Well, that guitar on the wall behind me actually belonged to Brian Farmer, who was Warren Haynes' guitar tech. He was a beloved figure, and he passed away in 2014 when the Allman Brothers were in their last year. And his family put his guitar collection up for sale through Gruen Guitars. And it happened to be in October 2014, right before the Allman Brothers were beginning rehearsals for what would be their final shows. And I found out about it. I bought that and I brought it into SIR Studios where they were rehearsing. And
oh my God.
Actually, Dennis, I've never showed this to anyone.
Really?
Well, not the guitar, but this. I ended up getting everyone in the band to sign it.
Wow,
It's not really
great.
my intent. I only wanted Warren to sign it, but one thing led to another, and everybody signed it. I bought the guitar very much intending to play it. I had my luthier friend shellac it on, so those signatures aren't going anywhere. But I still never take it out and play it. I wouldn't use it on a gig at this point, I don't think.
But I want to just ask you, like Muscle Shoals times, when he was a session player, he just kind of started, did he just walk into Fame Studios? Like, how did he know to even go there?
Well, I mean, Fame was a really happening place, so it didn't take any special genius to know to go there. Remember, the band included Johnny Sandlin, and Paul Hornsby, who were from Alabama and certainly were very, very aware of what was happening in Muscle Shoals. They did a tour of the Southeast. They got back to Florida, played in front of people who had loved them when they were the Almond Joys. And on their way back out to California, they actually stopped in Muscle Shoals and they recorded some sessions. Their first Hourglass album had come out and they were really dissatisfied with it. They were being sort of pushed by Liberty Records into being sort of a hippie Cupid dolls, dressed.
Yeah, they had little frilly, like
Frilly
Hermes
things and
outfits on.
Prince Valiant haircut on Greg, and the material was chosen for them, and they were really unhappy with it. So on the way back, they had stopped at Muscle Shoals and they cut a few songs. They cut this BB King medley and outskirts of town, an old blues song, and it sounds great. It eventually came out on the Dreams box set, and actually it came out on the Duane Allman anthology.
Yes,
they were really jazzed about it. They got back out to LA and they played it for the people at Liberty Records, who were basically like, what the hell is this? Like, we didn't sign a blues band. So they were just out and out rejected, which was really disappointing to them. So when they started recording their second album, and it was really not going the way.
Those Hourglass tracks that they recorded at Fame on their own dime, not by the record, they sound like the Allman Brothers.
Yeah, so you can hear where they were headed, where they wanted to head. And when that direction was completely rejected by Liberty Records, they started recording the second album. Duane was really depressed about it. Greg seemed a little more willing to go along with it. Duane started showing up at the studio so high he couldn't play, and then he just got frustrated and he left, and he just said, I'm going back down south. And he wasn't exactly a straight line, but he made his way back to Muscle Shoals. So whatever he knew about Fame before those sessions, he certainly knew it well after that. He went back and went to Rick Hall, who owned the studio, and said he wanted to be a session guitarist, wanted to do some sessions. And Rick said, I don't need any more guitarists. I got plenty. And the story is that Duane threw up a little pup tent and slept in the parking lot for a few days until Rick said, all right, come on in, we'll give you some work. And he started playing on sessions and just was immediately a sensation. And I think it was just his second session was with Wicked Wilson Pickett, a huge star, just to put it in perspective. He suggested doing the Beatles' Hey Jude. So it was kind of a wacky idea. I mean, who's going to re-record a Beatles song that's currently a top 5 hit? Everybody sort of scoffed at him. It's also pretty outrageous for the session guitarist to be suggesting songs, especially the young guy on his second session, who should just be happy to have a gig and sort of shut up and play his guitar. He came up with the arrangement and started playing it, and Wilson Pickett loved it, and that was really the start of the Duane Allman story, and ultimately the Allman Brothers story, right there on that song.
What was his experience with Aretha like?
Well, Duane was doing this work in Muscle Shoals, and it was clear to everyone that he was a great guitarist. And I think one of the things that's unique about Duane is that there are some musicians who, aside from their brilliant playing, just make everyone and everything better. Duane just had that special sauce. He had that special thing that people wanted him on their sessions. So once he was established in Muscle Shoals, he also started going up to New York and started to work on at Atlantic Records Studio. He worked with King Curtis there, who he became really close with, and he worked with many people, including Aretha Franklin. And his cuts with Aretha are fantastic. I mean, It Ain't Fair, which is Aretha playing the piano and Duane just playing a scorching slide guitar, is fantastic. And since we're talking about his session work, I mean, I think the other track we should probably mention is his work with Boz Skaggs on Somebody Loan Me a Dime. Yeah, to me, Loan Me a Dime and Hey Jude and It Ain't Fair are probably the peak of that. And it's just fantastic songs with great artists and incredible guitar solos. I didn't count Dirk and the Dominoes as a session. Yeah, but rightly probably should. I mean, he effectively became a member of the band for the Layla album. But absolutely, that was a bit of a moribund album session, and he came in and lit it up. And Layla has stood the test of time as one of the all-time great rock albums. And there's very much because of what Duane brought to the table and the sparks that he and Clapton threw off of each other.
Yeah, because didn't Jerry Wexler hear the recording of that song and say, who is playing that guitar line? Or was it a bunch of people heard it and said that, right?
A bunch of people heard it and said that. So Eric Clapton, so supposedly called Atlantic Records and said, "Who's the guitarist there?" Most importantly, in terms of the trajectory of the Allman Brothers Band, Phil Walden in Macon, Georgia, heard it. He had been Otis Redding's manager. Otis Redding had died in 1967. He was completely broken down, looking for new things to do, and a couple of things had happened that pushed him towards looking for rock instead of R&B. He was really well established in the R&B world, obviously with Otis Redding, but with other people as well, and including Clarence Carter, who Duane also played with. He saw at Monterey Pop Festival in '67 when Otis played there the reaction to The Who and to Jimi Hendrix and Buffalo Springfield and the rest of the rock and roll world, and he understood the power and thought it might be good to get in on that. And there also had been a convention in Miami, a record convention, in which tensions between black artists and promoters really was getting ratcheted up against white record company guys, managers, and DJs. And there was starting to be a bit of black nationalism, what they viewed as militancy, and it became a little bit uncomfortable for the white guys. And so those two things, I think, combined for Phil to say, what I really need to do now is get into rock and roll. And then he heard the guitar playing on Hey Jude, and he, said to Rick Hall, who is the guitar player.
And so, did he bring Duane to Macon? Is that how they ended up at the Big House?
Yes, eventually, but there's a few steps in between there. He went to talk to Rick Hall. Rick Hall had signed Duane to a management contract. And the idea was he was going to do a solo record, and he was starting to cut some tracks, but they weren't really quite happening. Duane was singing and he was writing. His songs weren't super great. His singing wasn't super great. It was serviceable. I mean,
Yeah, you can hear those songs on the anthology. It's like he doesn't have the pipes. He knows what he wants to.
Yeah, and they were okay. I mean, great guitar players have gotten by without being great singers.
Right.
It was clearly not quite happening. And Rick Hall was like a 9 to 5 guy. I mean, he was used to guys coming in, punching the clock, and working. And the way Rick described it to me, and I interviewed him for One Way Out. Duane and his guys, which pretty soon were Barry Oakley and J-Mo, he had latched onto them, and then Paul Hornsby and Johnny Sandlin from the Allman Joys were around too, from the Hourglass. They had joined him there to do these sessions, and they were just sort of like, hey, we'll play when we feel like it. We're not feeling it. They were more of an artistic bent. They weren't going to like just start recording. And so Rick was a little confused by this. He was not looking for rock and roll the same way Phil was. And so he just was sort of realizing Duane was super talented, but it wasn't really a good fit for him. And so he ultimately sold the contract of Duane to a combination of Jerry Wexler and Phil Walden. Basically, Phil Walden with Jerry Wexler helping put up the money, and that was it. And the original idea was that there would be a power trio, which was, with Jimi Hendrix Experience and Cream. That's what, guitar stars were doing at that time. But Duane pretty quickly had other ideas. He wanted something bigger, and that's that he set off in search of something more, and that's what led to the Allman Brothers Band, which basically formed in Jacksonville. And they had the plan the whole time that they would move to Macon, because that's where Phil Walden and Capricorn were based. So once the band was all together, they moved together to Macon. And there was still a period of, I think it was well over a year before they got the Big House.
I'm assuming you've spent some time at the Big House.
Oh, I've spent a lot of time in the Big House. The Big House came, it was the Allman Brothers group house. I should look up the exact dates. It's certainly in One Way Out.
1970 to 73, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. I think it was probably 72, actually. Yeah, it was long gone from the Allman Brothers world. It was just a house. And Kirk West, who was the band's tour mystic, photographer, archivist, historian, and a great friend of mine, in the way that I transitioned really from being like a journalist writing about the Allman Brothers to an Allman Brothers insider. It was really through my relationship and friendship with Kirk. And Kirk, in some interviews he had done in the 80s, played a huge role in Brothers and Sisters, which we can talk about later. But Kirk basically went and knocked on the door at the Big House and said, I want to buy your house. So He did, and he brought it back into the family. So the first time I
Oh,
went to the
wow.
big house was, I believe it was 1994. It was either 93 or 94, right after Kirk had bought it and moved in there. So first time I went to the big house, it was Kirk and Kirsten West's house. And they had the initial idea to turn it into an Allman Brothers band themed bed and breakfast. And Kirk had amassed this amazing collection of memorabilia, and he started establishing it and putting it into, putting it up on the walls. It was already there. My wife and I played Greg Allman's organ. He already had Greg's organ in that room.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, we're not really keyboard players, either of us. So we played chopsticks on Greg Allman's organ. Yeah, it was amazing, and I've been there many, many, many times since. And it's a wonderful museum. That was all Kirk's vision, and then a lot of other people, of course, have been involved in making it happen. So the Allman Brothers Band Museum at the Big House, I believe, is the official.
In Macon, yeah, ballers. I actually have a video about it where I'll put a link above my head.
Yeah, everybody who's a fan should go there, and it's an amazing and really cool
It's
fact that the Allman Brothers have a museum. I mean,
I actually thought it was a deeply moving experience to go there.
it's nice to hear you say that. I agree, but I'm so inside the weeds on that I've lost perspective. And I had the
Um,
opportunity to play Duane Allman's '57 Gold Top, which is incredible. I've got to play it several times,
oh
both
man.
through an amp
W-
and not through an amp. And
Was it still in tune? I, speaking of being an amazing group player, one thing that kind of sticks out in my mind is that the band that played on those Delaney and Bonnie records was George Harrison's. Like a lot of the people played on All Things Must Pass.
yeah, and a bunch of
Um,
those guys became Derek and Dominoes too.
Derek and the Dominoes. Why did Dwayne not play on All Things Must Pass? Do you have any idea? I wish he had, kind of.
That's a good question. When was All Things Must Pass recorded? It was in 1970, right?
Yeah, yes, I
Yes, I
believe.
think that Duane was just really busy with the Allman Brothers Band. But I've
Right.
never heard of any meetings between Duane and George Harrison. George Harrison certainly would have been well aware of him. I mean, geez, he played on Layla, which is all about Harrison's wife. But I've never heard of any interactions between George and Duane, which is interesting that it never happened via Delaney and Bonnie or something.
Was Dwayne a Beatles fan?
Well, that's a good question. I know for sure that the Almond Joys and even some of their earlier bands before that played a lot of Beatles covers. I have to look into a little bit about exactly how Duane felt about the Beatles, but he certainly was a fan and was aware of them.
Hourglass plays Norwegian Wood on the record that they didn't like. I mean,
He also often quoted Norwegian Wood during Mountain Jam, during his solo. I've heard tapes of them in the Almond Joys playing Help. And in fact, I was working on the liner notes years ago for an Almond Joy's live album that, unfortunately, due to some kind of copyright or legal issues, never came out. But they have a version of Help on there that was really good, like note for note. And I was curious because I was surprised because the date of the show seemed to be right around when Help came out. So I looked it up, and I believe it was 2 days after Help was released. So within 2 days, not just Duane, but Duane and Greg and the whole band they were playing with had digested Help and were playing a note for note version.
Alan Paul, thanks so much. Check out Alan's book, One Way Out. You can get it now, and coming out soon, his Brothers and Sisters book.
Anybody has any questions, drop me a line via this video or via my own social media. I'm easy to find, and I'm very interactive online.